this meteoric rise in success. I remember when we only had 6 or 7 of us in this state fighting for liberty, and now I check the counter and we're close to 700 in New Hampshire now with the free state For those of us who are natives and welcome you, thank you from the bottom of our hearts, because believe me, the fight is not over yet and we need all the help we can get. Speaking of the fight, Mary Ruwart is probably a woman who doesn't need a lot of any introduction to the crowd, but for the 3 or 4 of you who might not know who she is a woman who has talked the talk and walked the walk. She's run for office, the state and federal level. She even ran for the Board of Education. Could you imagine Mary Ruwart on the Board of Education? Yeah! And her most recent run for office was she competed for the LP presidential nomination. And a little trivia fact some of you may not know, New Hampshire pledged the very first delegate to that convention for Mary Ruwart. The topic of Mary's speech tonight is the deadly secrets about soaring pharmaceutical prices. She has worked for 25 years in medical research, 19 of those with Upjohn, specifically on pharmaceutical research. So she definitely knows her stuff, and I think that's all I really need to say. So, Mary Ruwart, everybody.
Well, thank you. I have to tell you, I was very surprised by this award. They kept it a total secret from me. Until they announced my name, I wasn't... Yeah! I didn't even expect it, so I want to thank you all for your votes. And, well, I'm just thrilled. What can I say? So today, my topic, of course, is deadly secrets behind soaring pharmaceutical prices. But everything I'm going to say about pharmaceutical prices applies to the entire medical sector. It's just that we can see it a little more clearly with pharmaceuticals. So if I could have the first slide, I'm going to talk to you about what it is I'm going to say today. And I have a little bit of trouble reading from here, so basically what I'm going to show you in the next half hour is that pharmaceutical regulations account for about 80% or even more of the current pharmaceutical prices that you pay when you go to the drugstore. These regulations, although they were passed to make drugs safer, have actually made them less safe. And they have really slashed innovation. This is probably one of their biggest problems, in addition to slashing prevention, which we'll talk about a little later. And there's been a number of other things too. Basically about 20% of the U.S. population that have died since 1962 when these regulations were passed were probably adversely affected. Their lives were shortened by these regulations. And so, as you can see, they've probably, as you might imagine when you start thinking about this, they've probably doubled the healthcare costs, because it's much cheaper to take a pill than it is to go to the hospital. And they've really made healthcare rationing a necessity. We'll talk a little more about that later on. And of course, as in every situation when you regulate business, you create a cartel, and that's true in the pharmaceutical industry as well. Now on the next slide, you'll see that basically the changes that created all of this happened in 1962, the Kefauver-Harris amendments. And you go and click right down the whole list there. These amendments were supposed to address the idea of effectiveness. Prior to their passage, you only had to show that a drug was safe for its intended use before you could market it. You didn't have to show that it worked. But a lot of other things happened too. The FDA dictated how you had to do your animal testing and how much. And it also required an employee to sign off on the approval, so there was somebody to point to if something went wrong. Whereas before, if no FDA employee objected, basically the drug could go on the market. And in addition, the FDA got the ability to tell manufacturers how they could advertise their drug and how they could label their drug. And that's why when you look on television, you see these ads for the drug companies, you see this big laundry list of side effects, because that's FDA mandated. And finally, FDA had oversight of manufacturing. Before these laws were passed, basically unless somebody lied about what they put in it, the FDA couldn't do anything. One of the first things the FDA did when these laws were passed is they put 50% of the manufacturers out of business for manufacturer violations, which simply meant not that the drug was not there or not in the right amount, but the FDA didn't like the way manufacturers documented their process. Now, one of the interesting things about this whole thing, as you can see in the next slide, is this emphasis on effectiveness, which is how most people actually know about the Kefauver-Harris amendments. But you know, drug effectiveness is very difficult. I mean, does it have to be effective in everyone to be considered effective, or most of the time, or sometimes? And is it effective on its own, or do you have to compare it with placebo? In the next slide, you'll see this little cartoon. It's a fake. I see, you can't see the top. It says, FDA approved sale of prescription placebo. Now, this is a fake drug ad, okay? This is something that The Onion in Austin put together, and you can actually find it on their website. But it looks just like a regular drug ad. And let's see, if my laser pointer that isn't really laser works here, I want you to look at this ad. You see it's for sucrosa. Sucrose is the name for sugar. And notice the tagline, it will work. And that's what placebos do, they work. That's why we run placebo-controlled trials, because you can give people a sugar pill and some of them will respond favorably. So there's really no such thing as a drug that isn't effective, and there's no such thing as false hope, because the placebo effect is a real effect. We just don't understand it, so we don't talk about it much. And that's probably why the Supreme Court in the early 1900s actually ruled that laws demanding effectiveness testing in drugs were not constitutional because effectiveness was a matter of opinion. You know? But however, the FDA in the 1962 Kefauver-Harris amendments managed to get around that. Now this created some problems, as shown in the next slide, and the biggest problem it created was that it increased the development time of drugs from 4.5 years, as seen in the light blue squares, which is what it was in the 60s, or I'm sorry, what it was prior to the 60s. And then as you see these dark red squares, you can see that every year the development time went up and up, because basically this was a blanket charge for the FDA. They would increase regulations every time, and the drug companies couldn't even sue, because the Upjohn company, the one I worked for prior to the time I joined it, actually tried to take the FDA to court and say, hey, you can't impose these regulations willy-nilly. There has to be some system here. And they used one of their drugs as an example, but the courts ruled that the FDA did have the power to impose these regulations, and the drug companies would have no recourse. So that really gave the FDA carte blanche, and every year they increased the regulations. Why? Because if anything goes wrong with a drug, and every single drug has a side effect of some sort, and Congress's attention is focused on that side effect, guess who has to come and defend themselves? The FDA. So they're really in a bad place. They can't approve a drug that's both safe and effective, because there's no such thing as a drug that's totally safe, and there's no such thing as a drug that's totally effective. So, they stick their neck out every time they approve a drug, so they keep delaying the approvals. And that's what protects them. Now, on the next slide, you might imagine that some people just couldn't wait that extra 10 years. And that was the AIDS community. So they basically opted out, and they did it totally illegally, and they were not stopped. What they did is they started bringing back drugs from overseas, because at that point in time, our FDA was so strict compared to Europe. What they did is they started bringing back drugs from overseas, because at that point in time, our FDA was so strict compared to Europe that they could go over to Europe and get the new drugs and bring them back and hopefully be able to treat themselves. But the customs officials would take them away. Well, finally, when this came to light, the FDA commissioner at the time, Frank Young, said, we're not going to be like the Gestapo and go into people's homes and take their drugs away. So he allowed patients, Americans, to go overseas and bring back enough for their own personal use. And he didn't last long at the FDA after that, as you might imagine. And this permission, if you will, is still on the books, but every FDA commissioner treats it a little differently, so you can't really count on being able to do that. Now, what happened after that is when companies like the one I worked for, the Upjohn Company, started to develop drugs for AIDS, the AIDS community didn't want to wait that extra 10 years for it to get on the market, so they just hired black market chemists to make them. Consequently, when we finally had a new drug and we wanted to put it in people, we found that every AIDS patient in the country who wanted it already had our drug. So we couldn't do the test because, these patients would develop resistance. So we had to wait until new cases were diagnosed to actually run the test that the FDA required of us. Now, what's interesting is these people actually had a very admirable safety record, and they really, in spite of the fact that they were breaking the law and everyone knew it, and the Times Magazine ran articles on them, nobody did anything because the FDA didn't want to have a hullabaloo, which the AIDS activists would have created, and letting people know that these delays were killing people. And the pharmaceutical companies weren't about to do it either because these are their future patients. So they got away with this. In fact, I understand there's a Brad Pitt movie coming out called The Dallas Buyers Club, which tells this story. And actually, if you notice at the bottom of the slide, the author Whitney actually wrote a book called Acceptable Risks, in which he describes the evolution of this AIDS community opt-out. So if people are dying, waiting for these new drugs, just how many are there? Well, the next slide shows the calculations. You can actually do these because we know how many people are helped by drugs. Now, don't bother looking at the calculations other than the bottom line. 4.7 million people have died waiting for drugs that we know are effective because of this 10-year delay, on average. This is a lot of people. And you might ask yourself, gee, is that it, or is there more? Well, there's more. There's a lot more. In fact, the next slide shows that what did we do? 2 slides? Yeah. Let's go back one. Or is that it? Okay, yes. Yes, see, it's not just about new drugs. The slide I showed you with 4.7 million people dying waiting for new drugs, these are new drugs, okay? These are new ones. But you know, there's a lot of old drugs that could be pretty helpful too. You know, aspirin, for example. Right after these 62 amendments were passed, Bayer Aspirin wanted to go and put out a little calendar pack for heart patients because they already were getting information that aspirin might help people with heart disease. But when they found out all the hoops they had to jump through to get approval, they said, we can't do this, it's too expensive. We'll never recover our costs because aspirin is not patentable anymore. And so we're going to lose our money because it's going to go generic the first day. And so because of this, we had, almost a 20-year delay in recognizing aspirin's benefit. And so because of this, you see, because of the high development time and high development costs, which I'm going to show in a minute, patents have become indispensable, really, in the drug development industry, and they didn't used to be. When I started, we were still developing drugs without patents. Now, the other thing is these regulations were passed in the wake of the thalidomide tragedy. There was a drug put out in Europe, which when pregnant women took it, created problems with the fetus. They would be born with either without limbs or with shriveled limbs. And that was, of course, very, very sad. But these regulations did nothing to stop that kind of thing. In fact, they actually created what I call the American thalidomide. What is that? Well, we knew actually since the early 80s, that if a woman took folic acid before her pregnancy, she could virtually wipe out the chance that her child would have spina bifida. But the FDA wouldn't let the folic acid manufacturers talk about this B vitamin. It's a vitamin, for heaven's sakes. It's not a drug. Because if they did, without jumping through all these regulatory hoops, then they felt they'd have to let the pharmaceutical companies have a shortened path too. So they said, well, no, you have to go through all these regulations. Of course, folic acid isn't patentable either. So as a consequence, even after the Center for Disease Control, another government agency, started recommending that women of childbearing potential take folic acid every day, just in case they got pregnant, the FDA told that folic acid manufacturers that they'd shut them down if they even mentioned this. Consequently, the American public was not educated about this for about 12, 15 years, and we had more babies born with spina bifida than we ever had thalidomide babies. And we don't even know how many were aborted, because of course you can test for this in utero, and a lot of those babies were aborted. So the very tragedy that these amendments were supposed to prevent actually created something right here in the US. Whereas thalidomide was mostly in Europe, we created it here with our FDA. Now, you might say, well, but weren't there some lives saved by these regulations? Well, there might have been a few. In the next slide, we calculate exactly how many we think there might be. And if you scroll down on this slide a little bit, you'll see the bottom line, which is that if you look at all the things that happened before 1962, and you try to calculate what it would be over the years these amendments were in effect, then you see that maybe about 7,000 lives would have been saved. 7,000. Now, even if this estimate's off by a factor of 100, and you multiply by 100, you get something like 700,000. It's still a lot less than that 4.7 million of people who just died waiting. And I've just begun to tell you the bad news. I have only just begun, unfortunately. Now, why is this? Well, if you look at the next slide, you see why unsafe drugs get to market. And basically, the thing is that most of the safety testing in the 60s was adequate for our state of knowledge. But the problem is, and I see we have a technical problem too, the problem is that we didn't have enough science to predict the thalidomide tragedy. Thalidomide only has those effects in primates and in one strain of rabbits. So it didn't matter how many laboratory animal studies were done, it would never have been picked up. We only began to appreciate with the thalidomide tragedy that there was indeed a problem. So that's what happens today as well. If we can predict it from animal studies, we don't develop the drug. But if we can't, and that happens a lot because people are not rats, as much as we might think so at times. So, it's not possible really to predict everything. So every time you take a drug, you want to remember that there are some risks involved. It's not just safety free. Okay, there we go. All right, we're back in business. So now that we have this slide, we'll go to the next one. And basically, what I'm showing here, we're not going to get real fancy here, but basically what I'm showing is that if we had had the same development costs that were happening before 62, you see this line here is what we would have predicted out here in the 2000s if the pre-amendment development cost trends had continued. If these amendments hadn't been passed, we'd be somewhere around here. But because the amendments were passed, look at this dramatic increase in cost for development for new drugs. Well, of course you would expect it based on the increase in time. That's nothing new. But if you look at the next slide, what you see is these development costs are linked totally to what we pay our pharmacist. There's a correlation, a very tight correlation between the R&D cost of a drug and what you're charged at the pharmacy. That's one way that manufacturers calculate what they're going to charge you. Of course, they have to take into account all the failures too. So it's not just that one drug. So it does make a difference how much you regulate. It influences what you pay at the pharmacy, and that's why drug costs are so high. In fact, the next slide, you basically see the summary of this whole thing, which that if pre-amendment trends had continued, what you pay at the pharmacy, and that's why drug costs are so high. In fact, the next slide, you basically see the summary of this whole thing, which that if pre-amendment trends had continued, the price you pay at the pharmacy would be about 15% of what we pay today. That's a huge increase. It's huge. Now, you might say, well, we'd be willing to pay this extra money if all this effectiveness testing actually saved us money on wasteful drugs that didn't work. But studies show that prior to 1962, only about 10% of the drugs really weren't very effective. And that's actually a generous estimate. 10%. Because the marketplace had already taken care of it. If physicians saw their patients weren't benefiting, they didn't prescribe it. So the marketplace was already regulating it well enough. Now, I told you I had only just begun. So now we're going to start doing the heavy hitting. The next slide talks about what really matters, loss of innovation. Innovation has been at least cut in half. Now, why is this important? Well, the first anti-ulcer disease drug that came out cost about $1,000 a year. Usually you had to take 2 courses, $2,000. That's a lot of money. But it wasn't as much as the surgery. The surgery was $25,000, and you had to be out of work for a while. So there's a big, big difference in cost when you can take a pharmaceutical. So when innovation is halted, that means cost goes up because instead of paying for the drug, you pay for hospitalization or surgery. And breakthrough drugs especially are not developed. Let me tell you a true life story. I was working on prostaglandins for liver disease, and I filed a patent. You know, we had gotten into the phase where you had to get patent protection for these things by that time in my career. And the FDA examiner for my section actually called me up, which is very unusual, and said, Dr. Ruwart, we understand you have a patent for prostaglandins and liver disease that's been filed. I said, yes, that's true. That's what my research shows. They said, oh, we are so happy to hear this because so many people die of liver disease and there's nothing. We have to prescribe bed rest. That's it. That's the best we can do. So we're really excited about your new drug and we're going to do everything we can to help you develop it. Wow, I thought maybe we have a chance here. But you know, that didn't mean they were going to waive the regulations. No, that just meant they'd look at our data sooner. Well, you know, liver disease, especially the kind we were dealing with, chronic liver disease, you know, for like alcoholism, HIV, well, of course, HIV wasn't around too much then, but hepatitis, what that does, it takes a long time to develop. And, you know, basically the liver gets all scarred. So it takes a long time for that scar tissue to go away. So we knew we were going to have to do a study that lasted several years in order to show the effectiveness of our drug. And, you know, some of these people, if they're alcoholics, aren't always compliant. You know, they don't always take their drug. So we had to back off a little bit and add more people so that we could get the statistical significance that the FDA required. You had to have so many people in the study to have that. And we didn't know what dose we needed. Nobody had ever cured liver disease before. We were breaking, you know, new ground here. We weren't sure what to measure. And if we guessed wrong on any of this, we'd have to start over because we had to have the statistical significance in 2 U.S. studies in order to market this drug. Well, by the time we calculated the time course, if we had had to start over, we quickly realized that unless we guessed right the first time, this drug would be off patent by the time it got to market, which meant it would go generic and we'd never recover our costs. So the company, probably wisely, although it broke everyone's heart to do it, decided not to develop it. This is how new innovation gets killed in today's regulatory market. Silently. Nobody knows. And how much does that cost us? The next slide does a calculation on this to see. And basically, again, I'm going to just ask you to look at these bottom 2 lines. What we're doing is we're estimating how many people are affected or how much money it costs, depending on if you think these missing drugs are 25, 50, or 100% as effective as the ones that are now on the market. And as you can see, the numbers are staggering. Even if you assume that the drugs that we're missing from innovation are only 25% as effective as the ones we have now, that's another 4.1 million people. If you think they're 100% as effective, these new missing drugs, then we're talking about 16 million people. You know, 4 to 5 times, 3 to 4 times what loss of life we've experienced just due to the delays. So you can see the innovation component is a very big component of this whole thing. It's rarely measured, rarely talked about. And of course the cost, the money cost of having to turn to surgery or hospitalization. If you go to the next slide, you can see I've summed this up for you because we don't have time to go into all the numbers, but basically 25 to 55% of today's healthcare costs are directly related to the loss of innovation that we experience due to the 1962 Kefauver-Harris amendments. That's huge. If you want to bring healthcare costs down, it's easy to do. In fact, the next slide has a quote that I really like by William Wardell, and he says that even one new drug, the stature of penicillin or digitalis, has been unjustifiably banished to a company's back shelf because of these excessive regulatory requirements. That event would harm more people than all of the drug toxicity in the history of modern drug development. And you know it's happened. You know it's happened, just from the little bit of example I've shared with you. So now if we go to the next slide, you can see where we got all this information that I talked about earlier about accounting for how these regulations account for 80% or more of current drug costs, have made drugs less safe, have slashed innovation in half, have shortened the lives of about 20% of our population that have died since these things were put in, and have probably doubled general health care costs. I'd like the next slide where Dale Greninger in the Wall Street Journal says that economic studies have been virtually unanimous. FDA regulations certainly cannot be proved safe and effective, thereby flunking their own criteria. But you know, it gets worse. Yeah, it just gets worse. The next slide really goes into it. You know, we talked about the folic acid story being the American thalidomide. It's very difficult to even get an estimate of this, but you know, proper nutrition is so important. At the Upjohn Company, what we had to do to make our animals sick was to take their vitamins away. Why? Because we titrated their diet very carefully, made them very healthy, and we couldn't make them sick. We had to take their vitamins away. That was the only way we could make them sick. Now that should tell you something. Like maybe we don't have enough vitamins in our diet. Maybe that's it. But the problem is, if you want to promote a vitamin for a particular disease, and there are many in which the vitamins work very well, and the drug companies used to manufacture them and promote them, but all of a sudden they couldn't do it because if they wanted to make a claim of effectiveness, they had to jump through all these hoops and pay all this money, and they couldn't patent the vitamins, so they couldn't do it without it going generic the first day. Now, you might imagine that if we had the proper nutrition, that the problems we have from alcohol, for example, wouldn't exist. In fact, part of my work was showing that you could prevent most alcoholic liver disease by simply beefing up the nutritional mix that your animals took. And this is true actually even in primates, so it does apply to humans. And if you know anything about drug development, you know that most drugs that you take today are actually mimics of natural substances. They're longer-acting substances in your body, or vitamins. They take a vitamin, or they take something that's in your body, and they change it chemically so they can get patent, and it lasts longer in your body. And that's what most drugs are today. So think about if you could use the natural substance. Much cheaper. And of course, we can rarely study them or do anything with them because we can't make those claims. Now, in the next slide, you can see something that really should give all us political activists heart. When the FDA tried not only to just deny vitamin manufacturers the ability to make claims, but actually started getting pretty aggressive about working with them and trying to say that all nutritional supplements had to go through the development process, those claims. Now, in the next slide, you can see something that really should give all us political activists heart. When the FDA tried not only to just deny vitamin manufacturers the ability to make claims, but actually started getting pretty aggressive about working with them and trying to say that all nutritional supplements had to go through the development process, there was an outcry from the public, which actually resulted in the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, which was passed in '94. Congress got the largest citizen response they ever had. People who take vitamins really know about liberty, in that sector at least. They should be prime targets for us. They hate the FDA. And this was passed, and what it does is it categorizes supplements as food, not drugs, and that means that the FDA can't push them through the drug process. But this is actually being threatened, as shown in the next slide. There is actually an international harmonization effort underway called Codex, which is a joint product of the United Nations, World Health Organization, and Food and Agriculture Organization. And they're developing these guidelines through the WTO, the World Trade Organization. They've already been adopted in Germany, and the EU is being pushed to adopt them. Now the next slide shows what these regulations do. They limit the amount of vitamins that you can buy without a prescription. In Germany, if you go over these amounts, Got to get a prescription. Got to go see your doctor. Now, any of you who take vitamins in this room know how crazy this is. I mean, vitamin C, 225 milligrams. Linus Pauling took 10 grams a day, 10,000 milligrams, okay? I take about 2,000 milligrams a day.
4,000.
Yeah, 4,000. Vitamin E, a lot of us take around 800 international units a day because that's what's been shown to prevent platelet aggregation, the initiating event in heart attacks. So you can see that limiting these things is going to have a big impact on health. And in Germany, it's already there. Now, on the next slide, we can see what Ron Paul's doing about this. I really love this. HR 2117. He didn't get to talk about this much when he was campaigning. But basically, this Health Freedom Act allows vitamin manufacturers to make claims as long as unless there's absolutely nothing, no scientific evidence to support them. So basically, he's saying, unless there's a study out there that says that these things really aren't doing anything, you cannot take them off the market, you can't call them drugs, you can't regulate them. Now, of course, even if this passes, there's going to be a battle between codex, which is going to be imposed internationally, or at least that's the hope, and what we do in our own country. But I love that Ron Paul is bringing this up and talking about it, and I hope he gets a chance to talk more about it because it hasn't gotten quite enough attention in my mind. I'd like to sum up in the next slide a little bit, just talking about that this actually, again, applies to all healthcare regulation. I've only shown you, I only have time to show you one little part. But all these kinds of things happen in the healthcare industry and other parts of the healthcare industry, and those of you who are physicians, nurses, physician's assistants know this well. It's really the major cause of high healthcare costs. It hurts more people than it helps, and it's resulted in healthcare rationing, especially when the government pays the bill. And I'm going to give some examples in the next slide because it's coming to us. Obama's stimulus bill has a little part that says that there's going to be monitoring of the cost effectiveness of our personal medical treatment. And what's happened, whenever government has done that, there's been healthcare rationing based on limiting care to the elderly and infirm. Now, I know there's a lot of people who have been active in the Libertarian Party most of their life sitting in this room, and elderly is where we're headed. So this applies to us. And for example, in Britain, and I think these are mostly, I think they're, I don't know about the hip replacement. The other two are British examples. You now have to go blind in one eye from this macular degeneration before you can get the pharmaceutical drug that will prevent it from happening. Yeah, got to be blind in one eye before it's considered cost effective to save your other eye. Yes. And kidney dialysis, if you're over 50 in Britain, you have a 1 in 3 chance of getting kidney dialysis. They do not want to give it to you because you're getting a little old and, not as productive anymore, and they've got to do some kind of triage. Yeah. Hip replacements, yes. Young people are more likely to get cosmetic types of treatment than an elderly person is likely to get a hip replacement in some of these places that have socialized medicine. In fact, Oregon actually created a cost-effectiveness list like this and got a lot of flack. Now they've recreated their list, and they're still getting flack because now, of course, a lot of the elderly people and what they need are being moved down the list. And in most socialized countries, you are not allowed to go buy your own health care. So it means going out of the country. So this is very, very sad. Now, the next slide shows another citizen effort to change this. This is the Abigail Alliance's suit. And what they did is they said terminally ill people have a constitutional right to buy drugs after they've been safety tested, but before they've been tested for effectiveness. And this is a group of cancer patients, mostly. They felt they couldn't wait either, just like the AIDS patients, but they wanted to make it legal. So they brought suit against the FDA. And initially, they didn't get a very good response, but they finally got one court to rule for them. And of course, the FDA appealed. The court found against them. And they took it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court refused to hear it. So the lower ruling stands There is no such constitutional right as a right to save your own life by buying drugs from manufacturers, even if they're not fully tested. So your disease may kill you before the drug is available, but at least you'll die safe.
One can only hope one of those Supreme Court justices gets the disease that they just ruled against.
Well, if they did, I imagine that there is a program in place that the FDA touts a lot about compassionate use and expanded access, but try to get it. But if you're a congressman or a judge, I bet you that you would have that drug pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So, this is very sad that they didn't win this. So one of the reasons they didn't is that the FDA in its appeal said this would destroy the drug development industry. It would create havoc. We wouldn't be able to enforce the Kefauver-Harris amendments. Yeah, that would have been okay.
Anarchy, chaos.
Life. What it would have meant is life. We're talking here about a matter of life and death. This isn't about a few more taxes. This is about your right to live. That's what this is about. And that's why I put the next slide and the final slide in here. You know, I am the chair of a private IRB in the Austin area. IRB is an institutional review board. By law, any pharmaceutical company that wants to do a clinical study has to get a group of people called an institutional review board to look at their protocol before they do the study and make sure all the subjects are protected. Some of the things we have to make sure that the drug company is doing is fully inform the people who are in the study. And then we have to make sure that the people can easily opt out of the study at any point in time if they don't like it. And we also have to protect what we call vulnerable populations, like terminally ill people. If the Kefauver-Harris amendments were proposed to our IRB as a protocol that the pharmaceutical firms wanted to do, we would have to say it's unethical and it cannot be done. And yet, it is the law of the land that puts these unethical regulations in place. Now, you might say, where does this attitude come from? It came from the Nuremberg trials. When the Germans experimented on human subjects, people said enough. We want to be sure that people who are experimental subjects, even if they're volunteering for the benefit of mankind, are going to have certain rights, and they're going to have certain information. And ironically, it's part of my job to make sure that happens when it's a pharmaceutical study. And I think it should be my job to help it happen for everyone. Thank you.